So I'm going to talk to you a little bit, and then I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And I'll start by simply saying thank you so much for coming out on a Sunday morning and continuing the awesome conversation here at the Army Cyber Institute. I want to especially acknowledge the organizers of the event and really say thank you for including perspectives that are probably a little bit different in this discussion, but I think still relevant, and that's what I'm going to focus my remarks on this morning. I also want to acknowledge this morning Aaron Alva, who's with me from the Federal Trade Commission. He's part of a group of staff from our commission in the Office of, what do we call it? I call it OTEC, but it's the Office of Technology, Research, and Investigations. That's the official title. You see why we call it OTEC. It's better, right? We've been staffing up at our little commission with experts who are technologists, computer scientists, and really being able to expand our in-house capacity to do research on consumer-facing products, and that's incredibly important. So Aaron, raise your hand. He's a great resource. You should totally ask questions of him. He'll be hanging out here a little bit this morning, right? I actually do have to leave to get to church, so. But we are here to answer questions after my remarks as well. So why is a federal trade commissioner at the Army Cyber Institute talking about cybersecurity? I think is the question probably many people are wondering this morning. And I'm going to try to answer that for you. The short answer is the Federal Trade Commission is primarily focused on protecting consumers. We're over 100 years old, and our statute is grounded in protecting consumers from unfair, deceptive acts and practices. Now, what that's meant, practically speaking, over the last 20 years is that we have followed consumers from the brick and mortar world of consuming into the digital one. We have taken our authority to protect them from unfair, deceptive acts and practices and applied it when they are consuming online and now when they're using connected products to bring privacy and data security cases. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like and how we're using our authorities to keep up with an era of very, very rapid change. I don't think I have to tell anybody here that we are on the cusp of this IoT-facilitated transformation, not only of our economy, but of consumers' daily lives. There's some metrics here about the number of Americans that had smartphones even just 2 years ago, and it was something like 50%, and now we have 80%. We have this explosion of connectivity with billions and billions of devices that are connecting every part of people's daily lives. I think I don't need to explain probably to anybody in this room that a lot of this change is facilitated more or less by Moore's law, right? So we have this regular doubling of components in an integrated circuit. And that's created this seemingly endless exponential growth in computer processing power. The sensors and chips in the devices that consumers are using are becoming cheaper and cheaper and becoming more capable and more powerful. The Internet of Things is collecting more data than ever before. Last year, Cisco released a report that the Internet of Things will generate more than 400 zettabytes of data by the year 2018. That's the rough equivalent of all of the data created from the dawn of the written word to the dawn of the Internet. And while that data and that connectivity is creating opportunities for better products, lower prices, and greater personalization, there are also increased critical downside risks for consumers. New vulnerabilities, new enterprises for criminals, and potentially new barriers for entry for innovators in the marketplace. In the last year, we have seen high-profile hack of connected car, news reports of poor security in connected medical devices, and just this last Friday and this last month, DDoS-facilitated attacks harnessing millions of Internet of Things devices. I was particularly struck by some of the coverage of the attack on Friday, when you see cybersecurity experts really identifying how hard it is to protect against an attack that is harnessing so many devices to really launch a huge DDoS attack, and how difficult it is to keep pace with that. So it's not a surprise that against this backdrop, consumer faith in their data security and privacy is actually relatively low right now. For example, in a recent survey of US households, 41,000 have reported, like roughly 1 in 5 in the survey, reported being a victim of a security breach, and 84% cited concerns about online privacy and security. Now, we have a concern about that at the Federal Trade Commission, not just because we're worried that consumers aren't protected well enough in our highly hyper-connected world that we're living in, but also that it may actually ultimately affect adoption of the Internet of Things. And that in turn could affect the benefits and innovation, not only to our economy, but to consumers of IoT in the first place. So the FTC's role in this space is multifaceted. First and foremost, we are essentially a law enforcement agency, not a regulator. Our job is to ensure that consumers are safe in the marketplace and that companies are treating them honestly and fairly. That means that manufacturers and suppliers of IoT technologies must be held to the commitments that they make to consumers. Our first IoT case involved internet-connected baby monitors. In that case, parents were using the devices as intended. They would set up the camera in a nursery, and through their network, they would be able to monitor their baby while in another room. Unfortunately, a hacker found a flaw in the device, and that allowed anyone who knew the IP address of the camera to gain access to the same feed. And they published the flaw, and soon live feeds from 700 different cameras and different nurseries were available for viewing by the public on the internet. The company in this case had made an express and implied claim that their product was secure. It also had made promises to honor the security settings that consumers chose, and none of these claims were accurate. Earlier this year, we had our first case involving in-home routers. As most of you know, the home router is a central nervous system for our personal networks. All of our internet-connected devices, from fitness monitors to laptops to tablets to televisions, connect through routers in order to operate. In our case against Asus Tech, we alleged that the routers presented serious security flaws that could compromise entire home networks, and that security of consumer data was not properly protected. For instance, a researcher was able to alter the security settings of the router through Web Security Portal and then commandeer users' internet traffic. Another security flaw was unearthed when it was found that a storage device connected to the router, like a thumb drive, could be accessed simply by landing on the correct URL address. Furthermore, data from the connected device was being transmitted without encryption, despite claims that this transmission feature used the best available security. Again, the FTC found that the commitments Asus Tech made to its consumers were not being lived up to. But what also made this case important, in my view, is that we allege that the company was made aware of these vulnerabilities and did not send out patches or communicate with their knowledge of these vulnerabilities with their customers. These cases also stand for something important, that companies must follow through on the security commitments they make to consumers, and that when security flaws are revealed, there is a responsibility for companies to educate their consumers and make remediation available. Another method that we employ to protect consumer data security and privacy is through our business and consumer education efforts. On IoT security, we do not have any regulatory authority directly. But what we do have is the capacity to teach businesses and consumers about the steps that they can take to minimize the risks. Each one of our privacy and security cases helps to create an understanding of what is reasonable and unreasonable security practice. A reasonable standard gives us the flexibility to keep pace with technology without hampering its development. It is also allowing businesses to create their own practices and procedures, designing what is best for their organization, the data they collect, and the consumers they serve. For instance, in a large publicly traded company that produces a device designed to collect and monitor patient healthcare data, that company should be held to a different standard than a small company which produces, say, an entertainment product or one that collects less sensitive information. To inform developers what is reasonable security, according to our view, we created the Start with Security initiative. This is a program which provides guides and also convenes meetings around the country that explains in essentially very plain English, very accessible for non-lawyers and even non-computer programmers or non-security professionals, the basic 10 steps that we believe really foster better security, according to the more than 60 data security cases that the FTC has brought. The consumer side of cybersecurity is really continuing to be an incredibly challenging side, as I think everybody in this room is well aware. For all of our efforts and the efforts of businesses, many consumers still do not practice good cyber hygiene. There are a lot of reasons for this. For some, it may be naivete. For others, it's a misapprehension of the threat. For others, it could simply be a discomfort with tech or just carelessness and lack of understanding. I was recently struck by this. I was advising a friend whose email addresses are all now very public, and I said, well, did you turn on the two-factor authentication on these accounts just to make sure that you have that backup? And he was like, what? Well, there's this thing. It will help make sure that if someone's trying to log into your accounts, you may be aware of it. And it turned out that he hadn't done that. And so we went through and we turned it on all of the accounts. And this was someone who's really sophisticated and knows a lot about technology and everything else, but just hadn't taken the time to focus on his own cyber hygiene. And I think a lot of consumers are in that position. The Norton recently released a survey of consumer cybersecurity habits, and let me tell you, the findings, I don't think I need to repeat them necessarily, but they're pretty disheartening. Just in summary, some of the higher level results. Less than half of consumers use secure passwords. These would be, passwords that are a combination of letters and numbers and symbols. 1/3 of consumers don't use passwords on their own phones. More than 1/3 of consumers have shared the password for their bank account with someone. And sometimes they're sharing it, over email and in incredibly unsecure ways. And less than 1/3 of consumers regularly update their passwords or devices, even when informed to do so by a company and a manufacturer. So, it's no surprise that we have a consumer cybersecurity challenge that is, in fact, growing in this environment as the IoT wave sort of crests across the economy and people connect more and more parts of their lives. I think the real challenge in protecting consumers in the era of connected everything is that many of the trade-offs that the devices require are not as transparent to consumers, and they really don't understand, in many cases, all of the decisions that they're making when they decide to buy a connected product. And I think we have to frankly acknowledge as a baseline matter that putting any device that transmits data online, whether it's to the cloud, to another device via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, injects some element of risk. Perhaps consumers should think to themselves, well, what do I care, if someone hacks my connected toaster and finds out my bagel toasting settings for Sunday mornings? I think the problem is that these devices, in many cases, are not only coming online and providing vulnerability into other devices that they're interconnected to in their home network, but also, as we've recently seen, providing a whole new range of technology that can be harnessed and used for cyber attacks. So this is, I will note also, security concern that we studied and wrote a report about almost 2 years ago, predicting exactly this style of IoT DDoS facilitated attack and warning about it. I think it's not actually hopeless, though. And so one of the things that we've been doing at the Federal Trade Commission is trying to spend some time not just encouraging better security practices, both through law enforcement and our Start With Security initiative, but also working closely with other parts of the government. We recently posted a blog explaining how our Start With Security approach maps completely and very well onto the NIST Critical Infrastructure Framework, and I think it's a very useful guide for explaining that in the government we are in fact using very similar approaches to improving data security hygiene across a number of sectors. Now, I think I will I would be remiss if I said that the Trade Commission hadn't called for comprehensive data security legislation. We do think more laws in this space would be helpful, particularly with the IoT. And I think it would be helpful to consumers as well. We're also working really across a number of different research areas, both to try to provide consumers with better information about the products that they are buying through better disclosures, but also in working with security researchers to identify some of the vulnerabilities and produce new research that can help inform a lot of our work in the data security field. And one of the ways the FTC is doing that is by bringing more technologists on staff. 2 years ago, we established our Office of Research and Investigations, Technology Research and Investigations. We call it OTEC, as I said at the beginning. And this office has been incredibly valuable to us. It's worked with security researchers to help translate research into actual enforcement actions. And we recognize also the need to deal with some of these future threats that are going to impact consumers. So OTEC is actually a multidisciplinary team of researchers, including computer scientists and data analysis, but also policy experts in information security law. OTEC was created to address the technical need, the critical need for technical expertise at the staff level, which we were really finding was absolutely essential as our staff of lawyers were bringing cases involving high-tech products. So many of our cases actually hinge on having a technical understanding of what is going on with the product itself. For example, in a case against Snapchat, we alleged that Snapchat was deceptive to consumers when it promised that consumers' snaps would be deleted and that they would no longer be accessible. But this was deceptive in part because Snapchat kept video snaps unencrypted and shared in shared external storage, meaning it was accessible through other means such as third-party apps. And having in-house technologists that could actually walk staff through the technical aspects really enabled them to understand exactly how the product was working and to detect the fact that rather than being ephemeral and disappearing, snaps were actually relatively easy to capture. Importantly, too, OTEC is now performing its own original research. In the last 2 months, they've presented research on both consumer drones and ransomware. On drones, OTEC found that from a security perspective, popular drones available for purchase today largely fail to implement basic security measures. Of the 3 popular consumer drones that OTEC tested, all used open access points without passwords, and most allowed root access to drones remotely with no authentication. And on ransomware, a problem that I believe is going to increasingly be a nuisance type of problem for consumers using IoT. OTEC profiled many different variants to understand what the victim faces when their computer is infected by ransomware. Research included changing keyboard locales to determine differences in ransomware infection based on different areas around the world. And here, OTEC found some pretty interesting things. They found that the ransom amounts actually vary generally and as time went on, and that negotiation with ransomware distributors usually reduced the ransom amount. Nevertheless, the ransom itself is large cost to consumers, and the observed ransoms ranging from $15 to $3,300. I'm going to ask Erin if I'm right about this, but one of the things that was really interesting in this research was if you change your keyboard settings to Russian language, your ransom demand dropped or was eliminated in a lot of cases. So just a little tip. There's, at least right now, an interesting way to mitigate some of these issues. That's public, right? Well, it is now. No, it was in the presentation. With not all variants, some of them. Okay. Anyway, you heard it here first. What we've learned as a consumer protection agency is that technologists are important to our everyday missions. In the world of evolving attacks, vectors, and resources, having technologists in-house enables us to bring cases that protect consumers against deceptive or unfair data security practices. having technologists also helps us think through policy decisions and also the unintended consequences of bad policy making. And so I think that's an incredibly valuable resource for us at the Federal Trade Commission, because one of the real mistakes we see policymakers making in this space is failing to understand technology and how it's working. So we're working hard to make sure that that's not a problem we have at the Federal Trade Commission. There's no doubt a public sector and private sector need to find effective solutions to secure the Internet of Things. And I would argue the next Congress really needs to pass comprehensive data security legislation in order to provide better standards around Internet of Things security. The sheer number of connected devices can pose a grave threat not only to individual consumers, but also, as we've seen, to other critical infrastructure and users across the Internet. We also need to make sure that these disruptive technologies and businesses don't disrupt our daily lives or become obstacles for consumers to adopt them, so that we can get the benefit of this innovation and really be able to harness it. So I look forward to continuing the discussion around these issues with all of you and to addressing some of the questions that no doubt you have about the work the Federal Trade Commission is doing in this space. Thank you very much. And I think we have plenty of time for questions. I see one right there. Do we have, oh, there's a mic. Great.
Speaking of unfair and deceptive practices, are you guys doing anything about end-user license agreements, and specifically nested end-user license agreements, where you start reading the first 42 pages and then you find links to other end-user license agreements. Yeah. You start reading that 162-page document, and you find links to other embedded end-user license agreements. And when you finally get down to the bottom of the nesting doll, you find out that you have absolutely no rights whatsoever.
So I think this is an important challenge, and it is one that we are looking at and continuing to be aware of. It gets to me to this sort of pressing problem of consumer the asymmetry between information available to consumers about the products that they're using and whether they can actually make informed choices in the marketplace and really understand what they're getting when they're using a product and what the data or privacy practices are associated with it. This fall, we held a workshop where we were studying consumer disclosures. We are trying to facilitate more research in that area so that we can have better solutions for people. Some of the things that I think are very promising in this space are research around, for example, privacy assistants. These would be assistants that have read, millions of pages of privacy statements, policy statements, understands them, and then understands how those map onto the privacy choices that you typically make around a product, and then it provides you with some sort of mechanism to say, look, we found the following things. Before you click I agree, you may want to know this is inconsistent with how you've generally set your privacy preferences. So I think that's an interesting area. We've also been very focused in our enforcement actions on not just the idea of notice and choice, but also context. And I think this is an area where the Federal Trade Commission's consumer protection mission is really going to move. So for example, context means you can provide notice that you're going to exploit the consumer's data in a certain way in that 60-page privacy policy. But if it's really, truly a departure from what that consumer should expect in the using of that product, then you probably need to do something additional to make sure that they understand the choice they're making. So the classic example is the flashlight app that's really hoovering up your geolocation, right? Because that's not obvious to a consumer that geolocation would be required for using that app. But we've also looked at this recently in the context of InMobi, which was a case that we brought against mobile advertising company. They were providing a way for app developers to provide advertisements in their apps. That's fine, nothing illegal about that. And of course, because geolocation for marketing is so useful, they had a product that was focused on providing real-time advertisements based on the location of the consumers. Again, nothing illegal about that. But what they did was they also cleverly thwarted consumers' privacy settings. Oh, I should say allegedly, because we got this in a consent decree. Allegedly, they cleverly thwarted consumers' privacy settings on their mobile devices by triangulating their geolocation based on the Wi-Fi networks that the phones were connecting to. And then they didn't even really represent that they were doing that in their app developer guide. So they sort of tricked the app developers that were using the technology as well. And so we brought a case against that as well. So I think that's a sort of expansion of context, if you will, but it's saying, look, you can't say if a consumer says, don't collect my geolocation, you can't secretly collect it by using another, mechanism that they're not aware of. That's like tricking the consumer, essentially. But I agree. This is a real challenge. We have started our approach to privacy 25 years ago with Phipps principles that are about notice and choice. There's a lot of value in that, right? Because you get to expand technology very, very quickly, and it's really hard to keep pace with high tech from a regulatory perspective, which is why being an enforcement agency, I think, is a very useful thing. And so you don't really want to be overly prescriptive, and I don't think we're ready to get rid of notice and choice, but I do think we need to move to a space where we're really making sure that consumers have meaningful choices and meaningful information. There's also some great DARPA-funded research in this space right now that I will commend to anybody interested. Mudge is running a project called the Cyber Testing, what is he calling it? Testing Lab? Yes, exactly. Anyway, he and his wife, Sarah, are testing software and coming up with basically a labeling system so that they can provide consumers with some sort of easily readable label about the level of security and the security hygiene of software products. And they did some really interesting presentations at DEF CON this year based on their research on browsers, right? And they're moving, I'm trying to think what's public about this. They're moving on into some IoT devices, and I think that will be very useful. So I think continuing to find ways to provide consumers with some sort of accessible labeling as we move into an Internet of Things world in which things are less likely to have screens and less likely to have, meaningful ways to provide notice to consumers is going to be really, really important. Yes.
Lieutenant Colonel Robertson from the ACI. I wanted to ask specifically about Mudge's work, and when do you think we'll see that come to fruition where we can use market forces to help consumers make better choices? And also, do you foresee a time in the future when we'll have an agency such as the FTC to regulate IoT devices, much like the FDA does?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think the short answer is I'm worried it won't come quickly enough, right? Because in fact, what we have right now is huge exponential growth of IoT products in the marketplace. And Mudge and Sarah are awesome, but they're like two people, and they're running a nonprofit, right? So I think that their work is certainly the future, and I'm really happy that DARPA is supporting it. I hope that we can continue to find other resources to help support it and grow that kind of research, whether it's their project or other projects in this space. It's certainly something that we at the FTC are very focused on. But the problem is, and we are seeing the real-time manifestation of it, I think, in these IoT-facilitated attacks, right? Is that we have a huge amount of products already in the marketplace. We have a huge amount coming on regularly. We have a really haphazard approach in this space. We have some companies that really understand what they're doing, and we have others that have almost no idea. And I think you see in the FTC report a couple of years ago on IoT is that we had identified this very wide range of security practices. And I run my own sort of personal experiment at the Consumer Electronics Show every year. I walk around to different booths, and I ask the people on the floor about their fancy new IoT product. what's the security practice that you're following? Like, how secure is this? And I find that if I'm just talking to a floor salesperson, there's actually no answer to that question generally in their set of talking points that they have. Now, if I'm at a booth and the CEO is there, sometimes I can get an answer, or sometimes they know somebody to call. But very often I get some kind of oh yeah, it's really good. We have really good security people, or some kind of really flippant answer, right? And so that says to me that right now there isn't sufficient appreciation, both from the demand side of things, but also, just basically in a lot of the sales forces around these products for what we're talking about. And I think we're not going to get to that until really more consumers are asking those questions. Now, the flip side is because we have a lot of really insecure IoT devices in really intimate parts of people's daily lives, I think people are going to start caring about this a lot more. And that's why I wanted to point to some of the survey results suggesting that American consumers are actually feeling very worried about their data security in particular. It really affects consumers when they see a hacked vehicle taken over, right? That really has an impact on them. And I think when they start having nuisance ransomware attacks to turn their refrigerators back on, they're going to be really concerned. And I think if their light bulb is DDoSing their house, they're going to be really concerned, right? So I think we're about to start seeing a bunch of situations in which consumers have a heightened awareness about why they should care about security. So I'm hopeful that we'll start seeing more awareness on the consumer side of things as well. But this is a very long way of saying that there probably is a bit of a market failure at this point, and I think that justifies legislative response. So that's why I would support comprehensive data security legislation, particularly stronger regulations. I would argue the FTC could do them for IoT. Yeah.
We have one over here.
Oh, okay, sorry. And this poor gentleman has tried twice too. Okay, then relinquished the microphone. Okay.
So, quick question. We've talked a lot about IoT devices, but what about all the rest of the embedded systems? Does the FTC worry about supply chain security at all?
We do worry about supply chain security. In our Start With Security initiative, one of the elements is that we are holding people accountable for their vendors as well. So we believe that there needs to be accountability all up and down the chain. Now, I'm well aware of the challenges, for example, probably the baby camera marketplace faces, right? If they're using chips that in a number of different devices that have problems. There, I think, again, understanding what the vulnerabilities are and figuring out if there's a way to replace them is going to be really important. Then if there's not, figuring out what is the right approach to consumers who have this product in the marketplace, right? Are we recalling them? Are we providing them with some kind of, is there a way to patch it? If there's not a way to patch it, are we providing them with information about the vulnerability? Are we providing them with a way to buy a different product that doesn't have the same problem through a coupon or something like that? These are all really new spaces. The other new area here as well is what happens when you brick an IoT device relatively early in its product lifecycle. So we had the really high-profile bricking of the Revolve product by Nest over the summer, and we took a look at that. What we did in that situation was we issued a closing letter that identified what we were looking at in our investigation, which was essentially how well did the company communicate with the consumers and how did it make them whole, because they were really experiencing the fact that the device did not last as long as what they were told it would last. And we found that the company had provided them refunds and abilities to get new products and basically make them whole so that their injury wasn't significant, and had done a good job clearly communicating what the problem was and resolving it. And that was in the closing letter that we put out. But I suspect we're going to have a lot more situations where we're taking a look at that kind of thing as well. Yes.
Jan Hamby from National Defense University. First of all, I have a farm in Pennsylvania where we have sheep and alpaca, and we're breeding next week, so if you're free.
I've never bred sheep.
They're a lot easier.
Yeah, I bet.
But then to my question. I look at a lot of parallels with what's happening with the Internet of Things and what happened when we first started rolling out an electric grid, and the real dangers that we saw in homes and businesses with fires and problems, and insurance got involved and drove the funding of the Underwriters Laboratory
Yep.
to come up with a semi-certified way of giving a due diligence stamp of approval to those products that could be safely used. Now, you've noted that the marketplace is not responding to this kind of need in the Internet of Things, and that legislation may be required. But do you see anything that might help keep it a marketplace issue instead of requiring additional legislation?
Well, so yes, I agree that there's a lot of interesting parallels here. And very often the discussion does lead to the sort of, can the insurance industry play a more meaningful role? I think it probably can. One of the things I found very interesting here, though, is I do think the insurance industry is struggling a little bit with how to quantify the risk here. And that may be affecting their ability to think about what products they're bringing into the marketplace. Although recently I was reading a report, and it suggested that there were some more. They were sort of catching up to this as well. One thing that's different right now than the electrical grid, although I think it's a very good analogy, is the velocity of the change, and that's the thing that I think is providing like a real challenge, both for industry but also for example, the insurance industry as well. And that's a new thing. We have Moore's Law, like creating this really fast cycle of change, and that's, I think, a bit different than the electrical grid. But there's no question that we have seen industries respond with some pretty good self-promulgated standards in this space. So, for example, the auto industry really I think, starting to do a better job since the GPAC in coming up with a response. You have the ISAC, Auto ISAC, which I think is useful. You have an acknowledgement from key players in the industry that what they need are good disclosure programs and bounty programs, as opposed to simply trying to get Congress to pass laws to outlaw hacking, which we all know wouldn't be a very productive response. You see the industry getting together to think about sort of self-promulgated standards in this space, and I think they acknowledge that they have to address these issues or consumers will not buy their cars, right? So they have a huge incentive there as well. They also, early on, agreed to a set of privacy standards as well that are enforceable by the Federal Trade Commission. So I do see some industries doing that very quickly. I think appliances, if I had to make a plug, like let's get I don't know if they can use an existing ISAC, but I would say they need something like this very quickly. And you know, I don't know if we need to take it kind of product by product in IoT. Medical devices probably need their own thing as well. But you know, we have to have more than what we currently have, I think. Yes, there's a couple question here, and then this gentleman here.
I know that much of the work that you do is all about the current marketplace and trying to make sure it's fair and appropriate. But I want to ask a question about the future and the role that the Trade Commission could play in that. I know that there's much work going on around the world that's more at the architectural level to deal with some important issues like combating counterfeit goods in the marketplace. And much of what we currently do in dealing with that, I would characterize like doing border control by looking for photons and electrons. We're looking for, you know, key signatures and minute details which keep changing all the time. Is there a role that the Trade Commission can play in advocating different kinds of conceptual approaches to mitigate some of these problems going forward? And if so, you know, how do you do that?
I certainly think we can play a role. One of the ways that we try to play a role is quite wisely 100 years ago in the Wilson administration, Congress endowed us with the ability to not just bring cases, but also to study trends in the marketplace to help inform policymaking. So right now, for example, in the security space, we're studying mobile security and PCI auditing and how that works. And I think those will be useful pieces of information to help expand how those systems are working in data security. We're also this fall in our FinTech series studying some of the fintech challenges, whether it's crowdfunding, but also cryptocurrency and some of those issues as well. We've been studying ransomware, drones, and smart televisions this fall as well. So we're actively studying technology and trends, and part of that tends to result in some policy recommendations as well. So I think we do have a role to play. The kinds of frauds that you're talking about too also implicate other parts of the government. So I think we do need to have a lot of interagency discussion. You know, one of the things I've really seen in the last year especially is increased interagency discussion around IoT, for example. So we see a lot of expert regulators, like at the Department of Transportation, wrestling with some of these issues. And one of the things that we've been able to do is really participate through interagency discussions and some of the learning that we have and sharing it as well, which is why I really wanted to emphasize how important I think it is to have technologists and be relying on them in making policy recommendations as well. And I think that's an area where the Federal Trade Commission is a bit of a leader in the commercial side of the government, setting aside the national security side, which is well established. But I think we can be a bit of an example for other agencies that are having to get smart on cybersecurity and privacy issues in a short amount of time. That's it? Oh, I'm out of time. Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate being a part of the conference today. Thank you.